think about it. This was not only the same generation, but in many instances the very same human beings who wrote in the First Amendment, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech." And then when they got into power, enacted legislation criminalizing speech. I've often argued that the most important word in the First Amendment is the one we take for granted, the. Here's why. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. They actually argued it in 1787 over the use of the word the. Madison arguing that by the use of that word, the Congress was recognizing that the freedom of speech pre-existed the country, came from our humanity. The First Amendment doesn't say Congress shall grant freedom of speech. It says Congress shall not infringe the freedom of speech, something that the delegates, or the majority of them, recognize we all have. All right. So John Adams, as president, had a little bit of a problem with his waistline, something I can identify with. And a congressman from Vermont by the name of Matthew Lyons made reference to the president's waistline. He said that the president was more interested in pomp and circumstance than he was in running the government. That didn't bother Adams. Then he referred to the president as his rotundity. That was enough to cause the U.S. attorney in Boston, who had jurisdiction over Vermont at the time, to indict Congressman Lyons for violating the Alien and Sedition Acts because he made fun of the president's waistline. And Congressman Lyons was put on trial in Boston and was tried and convicted and sentenced to a federal prison for 2 years for mocking the president in a system in which we had the First Amendment. Now, if you're from New Jersey or Boston or Chicago or New Orleans, you'll appreciate the second half of this story. Congressman Lyons ran for re-election from his jail cell. And he won. So Congressman Lyons is re-elected to Congress from his jail cell. He eventually gets out, he goes down to Congress. By the time he gets there, Adams is gone and Jefferson is president. Jefferson says, there's no way I'm going to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts that are due to expire. Don't even try and renew them, they're going to expire under my watch. Now look, we can relate American history. We can relate sordid epitaphs and experiences in American history in humorous ways. I mean, humor makes us get through the day, through this vale of tears into which we've been born. But when you think about it, a country that challenged a king and the most powerful navy and army in the world for suppressing commercial freedom and freedom of thought and freedom of speech did the same thing to some of its own. This would be repeated throughout history. Lincoln, as you know, incarcerated 3,000 newspaper reporters from the North. I'm not talking about soldiers who were shooting. I'm talking about newspaper reporters and columnists and editors and publishers who disagreed with his war effort. And he tried them before military tribunals because he said they were too dangerous to bring before juries. Have you ever heard that argument before? Have you heard that argument recently? Of course, after Lincoln was dead, a Supreme Court that he had appointed would unanimously reverse these convictions, saying the military had no authority to try these people. The Civil War, except for Pennsylvania, was fought in the South. The courts were still operating in the North, and there was no reason to take these people out of the ordinary criminal justice system. And besides, the First Amendment allows them to criticize the president's waging of the war. In World War I, the Congress enacted the Espionage Act, and that made it a crime to use words to dissuade people from going to war. So a guy by the name of Abe Gitlow, an immigrant from Eastern Europe, some of you will remember this device I'm going to describe now, got an old-fashioned mimeograph machine. Do you remember those things? It was a drum, and the drum was filled with some kind of secret ink, and you had a stencil on the outside, and if you turned it at the right speed and caught the paper at the right time, you you could reproduce your thoughts or whatever you had stenciled. So he had stenciled his thoughts and he reproduced them. He crudely made these pamphlets and he went to the top floor of the tenement where he lived in the Lower East Side and he hurled them into the streets. And he was arrested and prosecuted and convicted and sentenced to 20 years. 20 years in a federal prison for criticizing the war effort because it violated the Espionage Act. What part of Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech did the Congress not understand? At Abe Gitlow's trial, the government was not able to produce anybody who had picked up and actually read any of these pamphlets. And if they had, they would have been hard-pressed to find anyone who could have understood any of these pamphlets, because they were written in Yiddish. But Mr. Gitlow died in a federal prison in the 17th year of his 20-year term. This stuff keeps happening. We know that FDR incarcerated 120,000 Japanese Americans and 10,000 Italian Americans, not because of any allegation of crime against any of them, but because of their ethnicity and because of his perception that they were dangerous. So dangerous they couldn't be charged with a crime. Well, they couldn't be charged with a crime because they hadn't done anything. The Supreme Court upheld this incarceration in a famous case called Korematsu. The chief dissenter is Justice Frank Murphy, who was FDR's closest boyhood friend, which is how he became Justice Frank Murphy. Nevertheless, Justice Murphy and President Roosevelt never spoke a word to each other after Murphy's stinging dissent, saying, you can't do this. This is why we're Americans. This is why we're fighting a war against those people in Europe we call Nazis and against the imperialists in Japan, because they want the power to incarcerate people on the basis of their ethnicity and their nationality, rather than on the basis of anything that the individual has done wrong. All right, now 9/11 comes. We all know what happened. A horrible day in everybody's life. If you lived in New York, as I did, you know, the memory is, the images are seared in your memory. You just can't forget those events. The government, of course, would do a lot of things in response to 9/11. And one of them is to enact the Patriot Act. Patriot Act, which was enacted with zero debate on the floor of the House, was posted on the House intranet, that's the internet, available only to House members and senior members of their staffs, for 15 minutes before members of Congress had to vote on it. It's 320 pages long, and it doesn't read like a novel. You are listening to one of the few people on the planet who has in fact read this thing from cover to cover 3 times. Now, in order to read it, you have to have the entire U.S. Code with you, because the Patriot Act essentially amends pre-existing legislation. So you have to have in front of you that which it is amending. The U.S. Code is conservatively about the size of 3 or 4 sets of Encyclopedia Britannica. So you have the Patriot Act in front of you, and you pull the book down and read what's been amended, and pull another book down and read what's been amended. It's a tedious and time-consuming process. Only 2 members of Congress of 535 acknowledge that they read it. One of them, Paul Wellstone, is dead. The other one, Russ Feingold, is still very much living. Wellstone and Feingold were the only 2 in the Senate who voted against it, and they were the only 2 who read it. Now, as of representatives, there were 24 who voted against it, some because they understood generally what it was doing, others because they just simply refused to vote on a piece of legislation that it was impossible to read. It's impossible to read 320 pages that amend 5,000 pages in 15 minutes. Is it any wonder, then, that this thing became law, permitting federal agents to write their own search warrants? So we came a full 360 degrees